Thank you very much. This was my brief that was given to me by Bill, and it says experience from bats. So the first thing I want to do, I'll just work out, is why bats? Because lots of people ask me this. They all think of bats, sadly, even among biologists, they think of bats sometimes as a rather odd evolutionary sideline and not very important. So the first thing I want to do is just persuade you bats are important, just in 2 or 3 slides. They are extremely abundant and diverse. There are 1,300 species, so they represent 1 in 5 of all mammal species, so they're big. Now, somebody might say, well, there are more rodents, but when you see one rodent, pretty much seen them all. Whereas bats, on the other hand, and I'm not biased, are extremely diverse. And if you need this kind of excuse, they also are important ecosystem service providers. So they're important pollinators, they're important seed dispersers, and they're very important pest controllers. And there are a number of good evidence-based papers showing that they really do contribute large amounts of money to the US economy, for instance, in pest control. So they are important. They're also very vulnerable. Despite their small size, they're very long-lived, they reproduce slowly, they're often highly gregarious, so they live in large colonies in localized positions, making them quite vulnerable, and they're often highly specialized. So a very high proportion of species are at risk of in one way or another. And this is reflected in the fact that many countries now give bats considerable protection and actively promote bat conservation. So we've got a large group with a lot of protection behind them in many countries. So surely we know a lot about the conservation of these animals, and collating the evidence ought to be a fairly straightforward task, one would hope. And I came to this problem in 2 ways. One was when Bill approached us and said, would we be interested in writing a synopsis for conservation evidence? And so this was one approach that led me into collating the evidence. And the other one was the invitation to give evidence of public inquiries, where I was basically asked to, would you provide the evidence that this form of mitigation works or doesn't work for this inquiry to build a major development or something. And so those 2 streams led me into thinking about the evidence we had or the evidence we didn't have. So I'll take them both in turn. I'll start with this synopsis and give you just an overview of what we do to compile one of these synopses. As it shows on the other slide, there are a whole group of synopses being produced. The bat conservation one that we produced is just one of many and a growing number. And what do? Basically, we compiled a global list of interventions that could benefit bats based on the IUCN threat list. So it was done very methodically. They're all done using the same process. We collate the evidence from studies that have tested these interventions. So we're looking very specifically for real interventions that have been tried and have been tested. How do we decide which studies to include and which not to include? We look at only those studies where the effects have been monitored directly and quantitatively, at least to some extent. So we imagined that our first port of call would be peer-reviewed papers, since that's where we're most likely to see direct monitoring and quantitative monitoring. But we were forced into the grey literature quite a lot, and we found some useful evidence in the grey literature, but it is predominantly peer-reviewed papers. To make sure that our small little group were on the right track, for all of the synopses, there's an international advisory board to ensure that this list is complete and that we're not missing any papers, to make sure that our evidence base that we're collating this information from is as complete as it possibly can be. So these are the threats, just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that we looked into. A very long and diverse list. I won't spend very much time on it, but we've got residential and commercial development, agriculture, energy in its various forms, transportation and service corridors, biological resource use, human disturbance, including things like, some of the things obviously very specific to bats, like caving, tourism, natural system modification, invasive species, and pollution. So we tried to cover the entire gambit, some of which are likely to be very important to bats, some of which less so. And obviously, this list will vary differently in its relative importance, depending on the taxa that you're looking at. We also included not some threats, but some things that people are doing to try and benefit bats, like providing artificial roosts and education and awareness raising, which is a particular problem for bats in some parts of the world where they do have rather a bad press. So this is what we produced. This is just a specimen page. The whole point of a synopsis basically is to inform decision making through a very rigid and concise document. So what we start with each intervention is key messages. So in this case, we've got what's the effectiveness of switching off wind turbines at low wind speeds to reduce bat fatalities. So we start with some key messages which give some of the background information as well. 3 replicated control studies from Canada and the USA have all found fewer bat fatalities when turbine operation is reduced at low wind speeds. So a very straightforward summary of what the evidence is. We provide some background information. Those people who are maybe not familiar with the topic may need some definitions and some background information, so that's provided here. Then we provide supporting evidence summaries and all the necessary references. And so this information is provided for every intervention for which we could find some evidence, however little evidence that we could find. This document basically, as it says here, was to inform decision making through providing information. One of the things that the conservation evidence are moving on to is, rather than just saying, here's the evidence for you to make your informed decision, maybe we need to take one step further, and maybe what we need to do is actually evaluate these interventions ourselves using a panel of experts and categorize them under this sort of framework where we look at ineffective or harmful and likely to be beneficial through to beneficial and things like this. So after the synopses were produced, then more documents are being produced like What Conservation Works, which actually takes it that step further. Rather than saying, here's the evidence, you make the decision, it's a case of, here's the evidence, this is what we think that might also help you in your decision-making process. I won't spend any time on how this is all done, because Lynn will be talking in the next session and we'll give you more information on that. And this is, again, the document is designed to be very accessible, very easy to get the information you want from it. So this, sticking with the wind farm one, we've got, based on the collated evidence, what is the current assessment of the effectiveness of interventions? And then we're under beneficial, likely to be beneficial, and so on, we give the intervention. So it's a straightforward document, and if we had lots of evidence, the document would prove to be extremely valuable. And I think in many respects it still is. However, one thing makes these documents less valuable than we'd like them to be, and that's summarized here. We found in total 78 global conservation interventions for bats, of which 50 we could find no evidence whatsoever for the effectiveness of any of those interventions. So the vast majority, even when we bent the rules as much as Bill would allow us to bend them, we couldn't find any solid evidence to suggest that this intervention was good, bad, or otherwise. There were 11 where the evidence was too limited for assessment, so only 17 of the 78 could we really assess for effectiveness, and of those, 9 of them had some proven value as an intervention. So a lot of work goes into it, but at the end of the day, we can actually say something positive, something concrete about relatively few things. I've just listed some of the interventions, because I don't want to go into the detail. I just threw in a quick list of some of the kinds of interventions that we're talking about. So this includes things like changing logging regimes in temperate and tropical forests to help bats, encouraging agroforestry, roost provision, down to things like organic conversion or the benefits of agri-environment schemes. So it covers a very, very wide range of different interventions. But yet we still can't say very much about the effectiveness of some of these things. And one question that's regularly asked by lots of people is, well, you know, do we really need this evidence? Don't the experts know what they're doing? And the answer is, well, maybe sometimes they do. But in some cases, we suspect they don't. And I just want to move now on to the other sort of half of the talk, which is the case study that we personally became involved in, which shows where what we think is right and what actually is right can differ quite a lot. And this is a case study that we published in the last few years on the effectiveness of wire bike gantries. There's been a lot of work in the literature over the last couple of decades looking at the effect of roads on wildlife in general. And there was a number of very important published papers going back to the 90s on the effects of roads on birds. And so we assumed that if birds are being affected by roads, presumably bats are too. Just because you can fly over a road doesn't mean to say that the road is not going to have some effect on you. And it's assumed implicitly in EU legislation that roads will affect bats, and therefore when you build a road you must put in adequate mitigation to protect the bats against the effects of that road. And what we found when I was asked to do work on a public inquiry, I found that first of all, there was no evidence to actually show that roads did affect bats. And second, there was no evidence to show that the mitigation features that were being put in place to protect those bats actually were doing any good. So the first thing we wanted to do was find out whether we needed to do this work at all. Do roads affect bats? And just to summarise a lot of work very briefly, what we basically found was that bat activity and diversity are low in proximity to major roads. We found that as you move from a kilometre or more away from the road, bat activity drops threefold as you approach a major road, and the diversity of species also drops as well. So there is an effect of roads on bats. So mitigation, because it's a legal requirement, is important because bats are being affected. One of the solutions was these things, variously called bat bridges or wire gantries or bat gantries. And the aim is to put these things over a new road development and make the road easier and safer to cross. So what they're basically, I assume, I've not been able to find out who came up with this idea and what their thinking about it is, so this is an assumption on my part, but I assume they're meant to be an elevated artificial hedge. So you build a road, you cut down a hedge across the road, and you replace it with these things to guide the bats across. So they're basically a way of maintaining pre-construction flight lines. They're used widely across the EU, particularly in the UK. They're widely reported to be effective, but when I was asked to collate the evidence for this for a public inquiry, what I found was effectiveness was almost never defined. It was very difficult to find out what people meant by these things work. But on top of that, I couldn't find any evidence that people had gathered any data to actually look at it. So that's where we stepped in again. We thought, let's test them. So we studied 7 wire gantries across the UK, and we wanted some very simple methods that were suitable for resourced, strapped practitioners, the people who were asked to go out and assess these things and monitor them. We wanted methods that anybody could use. So we didn't do a before and after study because we weren't able to do so. We simply counted the bats crossing the road at dusk and dawn, and we said how many of them actually fly near enough to the gantries to say they're being used. And we also said how many of them cross safely, in other words, how many of them are flying above the height of the biggest lorries, 5 metres. So we asked some very simple questions about what was happening there on the ground now, not trying to do any complicated before and after studies, although we think they're important too. And the bottom line was that gantries are used by, depending on which one we looked at, less than 1% to a maximum of 11% of bats. And that was using very generous definitions of use. We wanted to be as persuasive as possible. Up to 84% of the bats cross the road at traffic height. Basically, gantries do not make roads safer or easier to cross. So, and the evidence was pretty unequivocal. I've put this particular study in just to show the importance of before and after. We're looking at the number of bats crossing per survey, and many of the gantries we looked at, these numbers were very much higher, orders of magnitude higher. But at many of the gantries we looked at, we had very few bats crossing. And that raises another question about the importance of before and after. We got very few bats recorded at many gantries. Has construction already driven the bats away? Or maybe there weren't very many bats there in the first place. Maybe it was just a case of poor initial monitoring and assessment. One of the questions then thrown at us, well, surely won't the bats adapt to these things? And I'll just briefly point out, this is a bat gantry that's been in 9 years. This is height, distance on either side of the bat gantry. That's the position of the bat gantry 8 metres up. This is the pre-construction commuting route. 9 years after the gantry's put up, the bats are still flying on their old pre-construction route. So they're not adapting to these things either. And we looked at lots of other structures, which I'll very quickly rattle through. We did find one overbridge in Wales, which was used very nicely. All the bats are concentrated on the overbridge. Sadly, this bridge was targeted at lesser horseshoe bats, a rare and vulnerable species, and that was a species that wasn't actually using it. So, the bats that were using it were all the common species that we still care about, but with a little less. Move on. And very quickly, we've looked at a range of different underpasses to see how effective they were. Some worked, some didn't. And the thing we really wanted to test was the green bridges, because these are also being built around the world, often at enormous cost. and they're also not being tested. I was in Australia a couple of years ago looking at green bridges that were costing something like $6 million Australian dollars, and when you ask the question, so do they work? And they say, we don't know, we're not monitoring them. So it's just guesswork. But what we were pleased to be able to say is the Scotney Castle Bridge in Kent is used by bats. Lots of bats are using the green bridge. Very few of them are going over the road, and almost none are flying in the face of the traffic. So to sum it all up, gantries don't work. Underpasses might work if you get them right. The one green bridge that we've been able to test appears to work. So the situation isn't good. We've got a mitigation program which is vast amounts of money being spent. One wire bat gantry, for instance, might cost £50,000 up to £250,000. They're very expensive structures. 6 of them have just been built on the A11 in Norfolk, despite the fact that we published 3 years ago that they don't work. They've just been built and opened this last year, so it's still happening. So gantries and novel bridges are being built all the time. This is the one that went up in France very recently. Everybody gets very excited. They all pat themselves on the backs. They have a nice reception, but they're not testing them. So they're not finding out. They're not gathering evidence to see if they work. So very quickly, 2 last slides. Are these problems unique to bats? First, I looked at other aspects of road, and we collected lots of papers which basically show that there's poor design of the structures themselves, poor design of the monitoring, if it goes on at all, target setting, implementation, reporting, enforcement, they're all failing. We start out with good intentions, but through a combination of, I think, of naivety and lack of resources, and sadly in some cases a lack of interest, it's just a box-ticking exercise, we're failing, not just with bats on roads, we're failing with lots of other organisms as well. And is it just roads? Is it something unique to roads? Well, I've just one paper, again, going back to bats, the things I know about, paper by Emma Stone and colleagues, which effectively assess things in a very similar way for mitigation for bat roosts in buildings, and they found the same problem. Poor design, poor target setting, poor implementation, reporting, enforcement, all of these things are breaking down at some point in the mitigation process. So, last slide, just to summarize. I'm being deliberately provocative and painting a black picture in the hope that somebody might shoot me down and give me something positive about all this, but the evidence is often weak or absent in support of the mitigation that we're doing. The mitigation is therefore often failing. Current practice often leads to poor evidence gathering because we're not doing effective monitoring in the process, and as we see from the A11 in Norfolk, poor uptake of new evidence. It's in the literature, we made a lot of fuss of it in the media that these things don't work, and yet 2-3 years down the line, they're still building them. So we've heard in the last couple of days why there may be poor evidence, why some of these things are still problems, but there's certainly problems we need to address. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks for taking the time. Right, John invited anyone to shoot him down. Who wants to? I can't see it. There's a speaker at the back, lady at the back. Yeah.
Hello, hi, thanks. I'm certainly not going to shoot you down, but I have a question about your conservation synopsis of interventions, and coming from a perspective of wanting to develop something similar for interventions in a different field. Assuming the evidence base for new and existing interventions is still, and their effectiveness is still growing, then how do you think you could make this sort of synopsis an evolving resource rather than a static document, with a route for practitioners and researchers to feed in new evidence from experiments or from actual implementation?
Well, the first thing, all of this evidence that's in the hard book or the PDF that you can download is also on the Conservation Evidence website. And so it's a searchable database that you could go and interrogate. And the hope is that that database will be continually updated. And in fact, we're currently looking for more money to be able to produce new books and documents, because that's how some people like to read it. But the database on the Conservation Evidence website will continue to grow.
Okay, there's one at the back. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's sadly very, very familiar, these sorts of situations with interventions at a practitioner operational level, often with competing demands on the amount of time which is allowed to design these interventions in an experimental way. And I wonder, two things that you mentioned several times. One was you'd published this data and information 2 years ago, and nobody's taking any notice. I assume you have lots of ideas of how you might improve that recognition of the report and where the barriers are of why people aren't taking that up. But also, in lots of different organisations, and not just in conservation, this issue of having the time and the skill to design an experimental intervention when you've got to deliver, even when you're saying this isn't the way to do it. What advice have you got for those poor people in those positions with their backs to the wall?
Right, two questions I think there were there. In terms of disseminating information, we're running workshops at conferences for like the Bat Conservation Trust conference. We're giving workshops at CIEEM. We're attending workshops around Europe where the road agencies are getting together to discuss these things. So we're disseminating them not just through the scientific literature, we are working very hard to get it out to practitioners as well. In terms of improving the way we do things, I think the assumption is always you want to do it scientifically, and that's going to cost lots of money and take a lot more time. And I think one of the things that Anna and I demonstrated with the bat gantries is the time. I don't want to reduce the amount of suggest that Anna didn't work incredibly hard to do this, but what she did really didn't take a huge amount of time relative to what the practitioners are doing already to supposedly monitor and design these systems. I think it's not a case of the amount of effort that's put in. I think it's just making that effort well directed and appropriate. So I think that's one of the messages we're trying to give out. Yes, we think things should be better, and we think they can be better without making them more expensive or more time consuming.
Right, thanks a lot. I'm sorry, but we've got no time for further questions, so thanks a lot, John.